The evening of April 15th, 1815, settled over the Ashworth drawing-room in London, with the soft golden light that always made Eleanor feel like a ghost in her own home. She sat in her customary place by the window, where the last rays of sun illuminated the pages of her book, a volume of philosophical essays she had borrowed from her father's library without asking because no one noticed what she did anymore. At 29, Eleanor Ashworth had become a piece of furniture, as unremarkable as the faded settee or the chipped vase on the mantelpiece, and she had made her peace with it, or so she told herself during the long nights when sleep would not come. Her grey dress, practical and plain, blended into the shadows gathering in the corners of the room, while across the expanse of patterned carpet, her sister Sophia glowed like a candle flame in pale pink muslin, her golden curls catching the light as she bent over a fashion plate with their mother. Lady Ashworth's voice carried that particular tone of animated pleasure she reserved exclusively for her youngest daughter, discussing the upcoming season with the fervour of a general planning a campaign. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on her page. Though she had read the same paragraph 4 times without comprehension, her attention divided between the words and the conversation that excluded her so completely she might as well have been in another country. Through the window, cherry blossoms drifted past like pink snow, and she thought how they resembled Sophia, lovely and ephemeral and utterly certain of admiration. The sound of her father's footsteps in the hallway barely registered until he entered carrying a silver tray bearing a single envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with ducal insignia that made Lady Ashworth gasp with undisguised avarice. The Duke of Thornfield, Lord Ashworth announced with quiet pleasure, had invited the Ashworth family to a house party at his country estate, beginning in 3 days hence, and the room erupted in Sophia's delighted squeals and their mother's immediate calculations about which gowns must be pressed and which jewels would make the right impression. Eleanor felt the familiar constriction in her chest, the tightness that came whenever her family ventured into society, where the contrast between sisters would be displayed like paintings in a gallery, one a masterpiece and one a disappointing sketch. She would be expected to attend, of course, to serve as chaperone and companion, to fade into the wallpaper of grand rooms, while Sophia danced and charmed and collected hearts like flowers. Lady Ashworth was already issuing instructions, her eyes bright with ambition, declaring that this was the opportunity they had awaited, that a Duke of Thornfield's consequence would be the ultimate prize, and Sophia must be prepared to dazzle. No one looked at Eleanor, no one asked if she wished to attend, and she told herself it did not matter, because she had stopped wishing for things long ago. Yet as she finally closed her book and watched the last light fade from the cherry blossoms outside, something flickered in her chest, some small, treacherous spark of feeling she could not quite extinguish. And she wondered if perhaps this house party would be different before dismissing the thought as the foolishness of a woman who should know better than to hope. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning of April 18th, 1815 arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that seemed designed to mock Eleanor's mood as she settled into the corner of the family carriage, her travelling dress of serviceable brown wool already creasing from the careful way she had to fold herself into the smallest possible space to accommodate Sophia's elaborate travelling costume with its countless flounces that required an entire seat to themselves. Lady Ashworth had claimed the forward-facing seat beside her youngest daughter, leaving Eleanor to face backward, watching London recede through the small window while her mother's voice filled the enclosed space with an endless stream of instructions that Sophia absorbed with the serious expression of a student preparing for examination. The Duke of Thornfield, Lady Ashworth intoned with the reverence usually reserved for royalty, was known throughout society as a gentleman of the most particular standards, a man of 34 who had refused every incomparable beauty presented to him over a dozen seasons. which meant that only someone truly exceptional could capture his attention. Sophia nodded solemnly, her golden curls bouncing with the movement of the carriage, while Eleanor gazed out at the countryside rolling past and tried to calculate how many hours she would be required to endure this house party before she could retreat back to the safety of invisibility in her father's library. She had read about Thornfield Estate in A History of Great English Houses, a volume she had discovered years ago when she still believed that educating herself might compensate for her lack of beauty. And she knew the original structure dated to the Tudor period, with extensive renovations completed just 20 years prior in the classical style, a detail that seemed utterly useless now, but which her mind clung to as a distraction from her mother's monologue about the strategic deployment of feminine charms. The journey stretched across 4 hours of increasingly lovely landscape, and Eleanor found herself noticing the way the spring had painted everything in shades of fresh green, the hedgerows white with hawthorn blossoms, the fields dotted with sheep and new lambs, all of it so achingly beautiful that she felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came when she allowed herself to feel anything at all. Sophia practiced her laugh, the musical trill she had perfected in front of mirrors, while Lady Ashworth critiqued the pitch and duration. And Eleanor thought how strange it was that she and her sister had emerged from the same womb, as different as two creatures could be, one destined for sunlight and admiration, while the other had been fashioned for shadows and observation. When the carriage finally turned through massive iron gates and onto a drive lined with ancient oaks, even Eleanor could not suppress a small gasp at the first sight of Thornfield Estate, rising from manicured grounds like something from a painting, all honey-colored stone and classical proportions, windows glittering in the afternoon sun like diamonds, and she felt her resignation deepen into something almost like grief, because all of this grandeur and beauty would be the stage upon which Sophia would shine, while Eleanor faded even further into the background until she disappeared entirely. The carriage wheels crunched to a halt on the gravel drive at precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, and Eleanor waited in her corner, as she always did, allowing her mother and Sophia to descend first, so their arrival would make the proper impression unencumbered by her drab presence. The footman in impeccable livery moved with choreographed precision, and she found herself noticing the way the afternoon light struck the windows of the east wing, illuminating what she recognized from her reading as the original Tudor casements that had somehow survived the renovations, a detail that pleased her in a way she could not quite articulate. A housekeeper of formidable bearing appeared at the entrance, her keys jingling from her chatelaine as she welcomed the family with practiced warmth, and Lady Ashworth immediately launched into effusive praise of the estate, while Sophia arranged herself in a pose of artful grace at the base of the steps. Eleanor descended last, her worn boots finding the gravel with relief after the hours of cramped stillness, and she was reaching for her own small case because she had learned long ago not to burden servants with her inconsequential needs when a figure appeared at a window on the second floor, though she did not notice because her attention had caught on the cornerstone bearing the date 1542, her fingers itching for the journal she kept hidden in her trunk, where she recorded such architectural curiosities. What Eleanor did not see, could not have known, was that Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Thornfield, had positioned himself in his study specifically to observe the arriving guests, a habit born of years learning to assess character in unguarded moments, and that his gaze had passed over the golden beauty posing on his steps with polite appreciation before fixing with sudden intensity on the slender figure in brown wool who moved with quiet economy and whose face, turned up to examine his stonework, showed such unaffected intelligence that he found himself leaning closer to the glass. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, was ushering them into the grand entrance hall, where marble floors gleamed and the double staircase curved upward like wings, and Eleanor heard her own soft gasp echo in the vast space before she could suppress it, overwhelmed by the sheer scale and beauty of proportions that spoke of centuries of wealth and taste. Sophia was exclaiming with practiced delight, her voice carrying sweetly through the hall, while Eleanor remained silent and tried to make herself smaller. And it was then that Mrs. Davies, directing footmen with their luggage, remarked that the restoration of the hall had been completed just 15 years prior under the direction of the previous Duke. Eleanor, forgetting herself for one unguarded moment, observed quietly that the craftsman had shown remarkable restraint in preserving the Tudor ceiling bosses while introducing the classical elements, a balance rarely achieved successfully, and Mrs. Davies paused mid-instruction to regard her with surprised approval, noting that Miss Ashworth had a keen eye, as those very ceiling bosses had been the late Duke's particular pride. The brief exchange earned Eleanor a sharp look from her mother and a detailed explanation of room assignments that made the hierarchy painfully clear. Sophia would occupy a suite in the main guest wing near the family apartments, Lady and Lord Ashworth nearby, while Eleanor was appointed a smaller chamber in the east wing, perfectly comfortable but distinctly separate, which suited her perfectly well because isolation was her natural element. As Mrs. Davies announced that guests were expected to gather in the drawing-room at 7 o'clock for dinner, Eleanor felt the familiar dread settle in her chest like a stone, knowing that the evening ahead would be merely the first of many performances where she would play her role as Sophia's shadow, never suspecting that eyes she had not seen were already watching, already seeing, already deciding that everything was about to change. Eleanor descended the staircase at precisely 7 o'clock, wearing her dove-grey evening dress, the one she had owned for 3 seasons, and which had the virtue of rendering her nearly invisible in candlelight, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the polished banister and steeled herself for an evening of careful observation from whatever peripheral position would be assigned to her. The drawing-room glowed with what seemed like 100 candles, their light reflecting off gilded frames and crystal decanters, and she counted 16 guests already assembled, including Lord Sinclair, whose reputation as society's most merciless gossip preceded him, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of every person for later dissection. Lady Caroline Langley, her childhood friend, whom she had not seen in nearly a year, caught her eye from across the room and offered a warm smile that made Eleanor's throat tighten with gratitude because at least one person in this glittering assembly remembered she existed. Sophia held court near the fireplace in primrose silk that made her look like captured sunshine, her laugh carrying across the room in carefully modulated trills, while Lady Ashworth stood guard beside her youngest daughter like a general surveying a battlefield. The butler announced dinner with solemn formality, and Eleanor prepared to drift toward the end of whatever line formed, but found herself startled when the Duke himself entered the drawing-room at that precise moment, his tall frame commanding immediate attention, his dark evening clothes immaculate. His expression composed, but his eyes, she noticed with confusion, searching the room until they landed on her with an intensity that made her look away quickly, because surely she had imagined it. The procession to the dining room followed the strict hierarchies Eleanor had learned to navigate through years of being last. But she discovered to her bewilderment that the seating arrangement placed her not at the distant end she expected, but rather midway down the long table, and more bewildering still, the Duke took his position as host in a location that gave him a direct view of her face across the candelabras and elaborate centerpieces of hothouse roses. She kept her eyes on her plate as the first course was served, hyper-aware of her mother's disapproving glare from 4 seats away, and she was carefully dissecting a piece of sole when the Duke's voice, cultured and deliberate, cut through the general conversation to address her directly. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and every head turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to shock. "I understand from Mrs. Davies that you have some knowledge of Tudor architecture." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as 16 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. Her mother's expression progressing from surprise to horror, because ladies were not supposed to know about architecture or anything substantive, but something in the Duke's steady gaze held genuine interest rather than mockery, and she found herself answering quietly that she had merely noticed the ceiling bosses in the entrance hall, remarkable examples of the period that had been wisely preserved. He leaned forward slightly, and she saw with amazement that he was truly listening as she explained, her voice gaining steadiness, how the Tudor craftsmen had used those decorative elements not merely for beauty, but as structural supports, and how rare it was to find them integrated successfully with classical renovations. And for perhaps 3 minutes she forgot to be invisible as they discussed barrel vaulting and the challenges of maintaining historical integrity while modernizing for comfort. Lord Sinclair's eyebrows had climbed toward his hairline. Sophia's mouth formed a small moue of displeasure, and Lady Ashworth looked as though she might faint. But the Duke smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, and said that he would be honored to show her the chapel tomorrow where the finest examples remained, if she would be interested. And Eleanor, forgetting every lesson in self-protection she had learned, felt something dangerous flutter in her chest as she murmured that she would be most interested indeed, before catching herself and retreating back into silence, while the dangerous hope tried to take root, despite everything she knew about her place in the world. The morning of April 19th arrived with golden sunlight streaming through Eleanor's window, and she woke with the unfamiliar sensation of anticipation rather than dread, though she scolded herself immediately for such foolishness because the Duke had merely been polite the previous evening, making conversation with an awkward guest out of courtesy, nothing more. She dressed in her usual brown day dress and made her way to the breakfast room at 9 o'clock, where she found several guests already assembled, and her treacherous heart skipped when she saw Alexander standing by the sideboard. But she forced herself to take a seat in the corner and accept tea from a footman, while keeping her eyes carefully on her plate. To her surprise, he approached her directly, asking if she would still be interested in viewing the chapel at 10 o'clock, and she stammered her acceptance while feeling her mother's warning glare from across the room like a physical weight. The chapel visit stretched into an hour of conversation about architectural history, and Eleanor found herself forgetting to guard her tongue as they discussed flying buttresses and the evolution of English ecclesiastical design, and she did not notice the way he watched her face as she spoke with animation about subjects she had only ever discussed with books. The afternoon found them both in the library, ostensibly by chance, though Alexander had in fact asked Mrs. Davies where Miss Ashworth might be found, and they talked about poetry and philosophy until tea was called, and Eleanor told herself this was merely intellectual companionship, that surely a duke sought stimulating conversation to relieve the tedium of a house party. Nothing more. On April 20th, he invited her to walk the estate gardens, and she agreed despite knowing Sophia would sulk, and they discussed landscape design and the management of tenant farms, subjects Eleanor had studied secretly because she found them fascinating, though ladies were not supposed to concern themselves with such matters. And Alexander listened with genuine interest that felt almost painful in its novelty. That evening in the drawing-room, she was reading in her usual corner when he sat beside her, not close enough to be improper, but near enough that she could smell sandalwood and something else, something warm and masculine, that made her hands tremble on her book, and they discussed the novel she was reading until her mother called her sharply to help Sophia with some invented task. By April 21st, the other guests had begun to notice the Duke's unusual attention, and Eleanor overheard Lord Sinclair in the morning room remarking to another guest that it was peculiar how Thornfield seemed fascinated by the plain spinster. Perhaps he was simply being charitable, or perhaps he enjoyed having someone to discuss his dreary books with, since the beauty had no conversation. And the words struck Eleanor like blows. reminding her of every lesson in knowing her place. Lady Caroline found her in the garden that afternoon and took her hands, saying gently that she should not dismiss the Duke's interest so quickly, that perhaps he saw what others had been too blind to notice. But Eleanor shook her head because hope was too dangerous, too likely to shatter and cut her with its shards. That evening Lady Ashworth cornered her before dinner and instructed her coldly to stop monopolizing the Duke's time, to remember her duty to help advance Sophia's prospects, to cease making a spectacle of herself with her inappropriate opinions, and Eleanor nodded and retreated into the familiar armor of invisibility, telling herself that her mother was right, that she had been foolish to imagine even for a moment that someone like Alexander Pembroke could see her as anything other than an oddity or a charitable project. And when he sought her out after dinner, she excused herself quickly and fled to her room, where she sat by the window and watched the stars and tried to extinguish the dangerous flame of hope that had somehow caught light in her carefully guarded heart. The afternoon of April 22nd arrived with the kind of golden warmth that made the entire estate seem to glow with promise, and Eleanor wore her sprigged muslin dress, the one faded from many washings but still respectable, as she made her way reluctantly to the garden party that had been planned for 3 o'clock, knowing she could not avoid the gathering without drawing more unwanted attention. White-clothed tables had been arranged beneath the spreading oak trees on the south lawn, and she could see perhaps 20 guests already assembled, their pastel silks and dark tailcoats creating a painting of genteel leisure, while servants moved between them carrying trays of refreshments, and the sound of cultivated laughter drifted on the warm breeze. She positioned herself near the ancient oak at the garden's edge, the one that must have been 200 years old, its massive trunk providing both shade and a measure of concealment, and she accepted a cup of tea from a passing footman while observing Sophia hold court beneath a rose arbor, surrounded by 3 admirers who hung on her every pronouncement about the superior quality of London shops. Eleanor had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes, invisible as usual, when Alexander appeared at her elbow so suddenly that she startled and nearly dropped her teacup, his own cup in hand, his expression warm as he asked if she was enjoying the party and whether she had noticed the remarkable specimen of climbing rose behind her, a variety he believed had been planted during Queen Anne's reign. They fell into conversation about historical gardening practices, and Eleanor forgot to guard her enthusiasm as she discussed the evolution of English landscape design from formal Tudor knot gardens to the more natural aesthetic now in fashion, and she did not notice that they had drifted slightly away from the main party, moving around the oak's trunk until they were partially obscured from general view. Alexander had brought with him a slim volume of poetry, and he mentioned that he had found this collection in the library and wondered if she had read it, and they both reached for the book at the same moment, their fingers nearly touching on its leather binding, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his hand, and the contact that did not quite happen sent an electric current through her entire body that left her breathless and confused. The moment stretched between them, his fingers a hair's breadth from hers, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her heart pound painfully against her ribs, and she saw something in his expression that looked almost like longing. But before she could process what was happening, her mother's voice cut sharply across the garden, calling her name. Eleanor stepped back so quickly she stumbled, and Alexander steadied her with a hand at her elbow, a touch that burned through the thin muslin of her sleeve. But Lady Ashworth was already bearing down upon them, her face composed in pleasant lines that did not reach her glacial eyes, announcing brightly that Eleanor was needed immediately to help Sophia with some unspecified task. As her mother steered her firmly back toward the main party, Eleanor heard Lord Sinclair's carrying voice remark to his companion that it was extraordinary how the Duke continued to waste his time with the spinster when there were so many worthier objects for his attention. Perhaps he simply enjoyed having someone who could actually discuss something beyond fashion and gossip, though one could hardly imagine it would lead anywhere, After all, there were limits to charity, and a duke had obligations to consider. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each one confirming what she had known all along, that she had been foolish to imagine even for a heartbeat that the near touch of hands had meant anything beyond accidental proximity. And as she was pulled away, she glanced back once to see Alexander still standing beneath the oak tree, the book of poetry in his hands, his expression thunderous as he stared after her. And the golden afternoon suddenly seemed leached of all its warmth. Eleanor retreated to her room at 7 o'clock that evening, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, and she told herself firmly that she had been a fool to allow even the smallest ember of hope to kindle when she knew perfectly well what she was and what she could never be. And the sound of Lord Sinclair's carrying voice still echoed in her mind like the tolling of a funeral bell, each word a confirmation of every truth she had spent 29 years learning. She pulled her worn trunk from beneath the bed and began folding her few dresses with mechanical precision, deciding that she would plead a headache in the morning and request the carriage to return her to London, because she could not bear another 3 days of this exquisite torture, watching Alexander be kind to her out of courtesy, while knowing that everyone else was laughing at the pathetic spinster who had somehow mistaken polite attention for something more. The rain had begun outside her window, fat drops spattering against the glass in rhythm with her agitated thoughts, and she was folding her brown day dress when a soft knock came at her door. And Lady Caroline entered without waiting for permission, her expression troubled as she took in the open trunk and Eleanor's tear-stained face. Caroline closed the door firmly and crossed to take Eleanor's hands, saying gently that she was making a terrible mistake, that she had watched the Duke these past 4 days, and she had never seen a man more thoroughly captivated, that his attention was not charity but genuine regard. But Eleanor shook her head and pulled away, explaining in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to control it, that she knew her place, that she had been foolish to forget it even briefly, that men like Alexander Pembroke did not fall in love with women like her, no matter how many books they discussed. Caroline argued for 20 minutes, her voice growing more insistent, but Eleanor remained resolute even as tears continued to slide down her cheeks. And finally her friend left with a parting plea that she reconsider, that she not let fear and old wounds rob her of something precious that was being freely offered. Alone again, Eleanor continued her packing, but her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the buttons and ribbons, and she found herself standing at the window, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens, where just hours ago she had stood with Alexander and reached for that book of poetry, and felt something pass between them that had seemed almost like magic, though she knew now it had been merely her imagination transforming ordinary courtesy into romance. What she did not know, what she could not possibly know as she stood there with her forehead pressed against the cold glass, was that at that very moment Alexander was sitting in Lord Ashworth's study 2 floors below, the firelight casting shadows across his determined face as he formally requested permission to pay his addresses to Eleanor. And Lord Ashworth, that distant but kind man who had always harboured guilt about his eldest daughter's unhappiness, was giving his blessing with tears in his eyes and a handshake that conveyed 29 years of paternal regret and hope. The rain continued to fall as Eleanor finally abandoned her packing and climbed into bed still fully dressed, pulling the coverlet over herself as if she could hide from the pain, resolving that she would be strong, that she would armor herself once more in the familiar protection of invisibility and low expectations, that she would survive this just as she had survived every other disappointment, never dreaming that her life was about to transform in ways she could not imagine, that the man she was trying so desperately to forget was even now planning how to claim her heart in a manner so public and irrevocable that neither her mother nor society itself could stand in their way. Eleanor woke at first light on April 23rd after a restless night filled with fragmented dreams, and she dressed herself in her plainest grey morning dress, the one that made her disappear into woodwork and shadows, armoring herself once more in the invisibility that had always been her refuge and her curse, resolving that she would avoid Alexander entirely for this final day before she pleaded illness and returned to London. She descended to the breakfast room at 8 o'clock to find most of the guests already assembled, and she took her customary seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, as far from the center of attention as possible, accepting toast and tea from a footman while keeping her eyes firmly on her plate and willing herself to become invisible once more. The rain had cleared overnight, and brilliant morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the faces of Lord Sinclair and his companion as they discussed the previous day's gossip in voices just loud enough to carry, and Eleanor forced herself to chew and swallow, though the food tasted like ashes in her mouth. Sophia swept in at 8:15, looking triumphant in a gown of pale pink muslin, settling herself in the chair that provided the best view of the doorway, and Lady Ashworth followed moments later with an expression of such smug satisfaction that Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach, though she could not have said why her mother's mood filled her with such foreboding. The conversation flowed around Eleanor like water around a stone. Lady Caroline attempted twice to catch her eye with concerned glances, but Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on her teacup as if it contained all the secrets of the universe, counting the minutes until she could escape back to her room. Alexander did not appear at his usual time of 8:30, and Eleanor told herself she was relieved rather than disappointed that his absence made everything easier. But at 9 o'clock the door opened, and he entered wearing formal morning attire that immediately signaled this was no ordinary day. His charcoal coat fitted perfectly across his shoulders, and his cravat tied with unusual care. The room fell silent as he took his place at the head of the table, and Eleanor risked one quick glance at his face before looking away, seeing in that brief moment something purposeful and resolute in his expression that made her heart begin to pound with nameless anxiety. Alexander surveyed the assembled company, his gaze moving methodically from face to face, and when his eyes found Eleanor, she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, but she looked down immediately, unable to bear whatever she might see there. He cleared his throat and announced in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly hushed room that he had important news to share with everyone, news that he would reveal formally at dinner this evening at 8 o'clock, and he hoped all the guests would make certain to attend, as this would be an announcement of great personal significance. Speculation erupted the moment he finished speaking, voices rising in excited conjecture, and Eleanor sat frozen in her chair as the obvious conclusion rippled through the room that the Duke was preparing to announce a courtship, and every eye in the room turned to assess Sophia, who blushed prettily and lowered her lashes in a performance of maidenly modesty, while Lady Ashworth's smile grew sharp with victory. Eleanor fled the breakfast room the moment she could escape without drawing further attention, her mind reeling with the certainty that she would be forced to witness Alexander announce his intention to court someone appropriate this evening, most likely Sophia, or perhaps one of the other young ladies present, and she could not bear it, could not endure sitting through dinner watching her mother's triumph and knowing that the past 5 days of conversation and connection had been nothing but her own foolish imagination transforming courtesy into something more. She took refuge in the library at 10 o'clock, seeking solace among the familiar leather spines and the scent of old paper, but she had barely settled into the window seat with a volume of poetry when the door opened and Alexander entered, his expression purposeful as his eyes found her immediately. And Eleanor felt panic surge through her chest as he crossed toward her with clear intent to speak privately. She stood abruptly, the book tumbling from her lap, and mumbled something incoherent about needing to check on Sophia, brushing past him before he could say whatever he had come to say, fleeing like a coward but unable to stop herself, and she did not see the frustration and dismay that crossed his face as he watched her retreat. At noon she attempted a walk in the gardens, hoping the spring air might calm her agitation, taking the narrow path that led past the rose beds toward the small ornamental lake. But she had gone barely 50 yards when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Alexander approaching, still wearing that same determined expression, and before he could speak, she blurted out that he should not concern himself with her, that she understood perfectly well that his attentions had been merely kindness, and she harbored no foolish expectations, that she wished him every happiness with whomever he chose. Alexander stopped as if she had struck him, something raw and almost pained flashing across his features, and he said her name in a tone she had never heard from him before, low and urgent. But at that moment, Lady Ashworth's voice called from the terrace, demanding Eleanor's presence immediately, and Eleanor seized the interruption like a lifeline, hurrying back toward the house, while Alexander remained standing on the garden path, his hands clenched at his sides. The afternoon stretched into torture as Eleanor helped Sophia prepare for the evening, watching her sister try on 4 different gowns while their mother fussed over every detail, certain that tonight would mark the beginning of Sophia's elevation to Duchess, and Eleanor felt each minute tick past like a drop of poison. Knowing she should leave, should plead illness and hide in her room, but unable to deny her mother's sharp commands to assist. At 4 o'clock, Lady Caroline found her in the music room, where she had retreated to escape her mother's gloating, and Caroline gripped her hands tightly, saying that she was being deliberately blind, that Alexander had been trying all day to speak with her privately, and she kept running away, that whatever announcement he planned to make this evening, Eleanor needed to trust that it was not what she feared. But Eleanor shook her head and pulled away, explaining in a voice that barely rose above a whisper that she could not survive hoping again, that hope had always been her enemy, that she would rather face the pain with her armor intact than let herself believe in something impossible only to have it shattered publicly before the entire assembly. Caroline argued passionately, but Eleanor remained resolute, and finally her friend left with tears in her eyes and a final plea that Eleanor have faith. But faith had never served Eleanor well, and she could not summon it now, not even as she returned to her room at 6 o'clock to dress for dinner, choosing a gown of deep burgundy that made her feel less invisible than her usual greys, though she told herself it did not matter what she wore to witness her own heart breaking. Eleanor descended the grand staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, wearing the burgundy gown that made her feel less like a shadow, her heart encased in ice as she prepared herself to witness the death of hope. And she entered the formal dining room to find all the guests already assembled, the long table set with gleaming silver and crystal that caught the light of 100 candles in the massive chandeliers overhead, creating an almost theatrical brilliance that seemed designed to illuminate every nuance of expression and reaction. She moved automatically toward her usual seat at the far end of the table, but Alexander's butler intervened smoothly, guiding her instead to a chair near the center, and she realized with mounting dread that the seating arrangement had been deliberately altered, that she was now positioned directly beside the head of the table where Alexander would sit, while Sophia had been placed directly across from that seat, radiant in pink silk and practically glowing with anticipation. Eleanor sank into her chair, feeling exposed and vulnerable, acutely aware of every eye in the room tracking her movements, and she heard Lady Ashworth's sharp intake of breath at this unexpected arrangement. But before her mother could object, Alexander entered the room, and the moment for protest passed as everyone rose briefly in acknowledgement of their host. He wore evening dress of severe black and white that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the stark planes of his face, and there was something in his bearing that commanded absolute attention, a gravity that silenced the whispered speculation and made even Lord Sinclair cease his commentary, as Alexander took his place at the head of the table and gestured for everyone to be seated. The first course was served in near silence, the usual dinner conversation muted by the weight of anticipation, and Eleanor mechanically lifted her soup spoon, though she could not have said what she was eating, tasting nothing, aware only of Alexander's presence beside her, and the way Sophia kept glancing between them with growing confusion, as if trying to understand why the seating had placed Eleanor in the position of honor rather than herself. Alexander ate nothing, Eleanor noticed from the corner of her eye, and when the second course was served, he finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room as he announced that he wished to share his news now rather than waiting until meal's end, and Eleanor felt her entire body go rigid, every muscle tensing as if to absorb a physical blow. She fixed her eyes on her untouched plate and waited for the words that would shatter her. But then she felt something warm close gently around her left hand, where it rested in her lap beneath the table, hidden from view by the heavy damask tablecloth, and shock jolted through her as she realized Alexander had reached over and taken her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that was both tender and unbreakable. Her head snapped up involuntarily, and she stared at him in confusion and disbelief. But he was looking out at the assembled guests, still holding her hand beneath the table where no one could see, his thumb moving in a slow, deliberate stroke across her knuckles that sent heat racing up her arm, and she heard him say in that same clear, carrying voice that he had asked them all here tonight to witness an announcement of great importance to him, that after much consideration he had made a decision that would determine the course of his future. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand captive in his, unable to process the contradiction between what she was feeling and what she was hearing. And she watched as if from a great distance, as Alexander turned his head to look directly at Sophia, his gaze settling on her sister's expectant face while his hand tightened around Eleanor's beneath the table. And he said with perfect clarity and unmistakable intent that he was honored to announce his engagement, that he had sought and received her father's blessing, and that he hoped everyone present would wish them joy. And then, in the moment when the entire room drew breath to congratulate Sophia, when Lady Ashworth's face transformed with triumph and Sophia's lips parted in rehearsed surprise, Alexander turned away from Sophia and looked directly at Eleanor instead, his grey eyes burning into hers with an intensity that stole her breath, and he finished his sentence by saying clearly and deliberately for all to hear that he was engaged to Miss Eleanor Ashworth, and would be honored if she would consent to become his wife and Duchess, while beneath the table his hand gripped hers with unmistakable possession, and his thumb continued its gentle, devastating stroke across her trembling fingers. The silence that followed Alexander's declaration lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt eternal to Eleanor, who sat frozen in her chair with her hand still imprisoned in his beneath the table, unable to move or breathe or think as her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. And then the room erupted into chaos as Lady Ashworth let out an audible gasp that sounded more like a strangled cry, while Sophia's face transformed from expectant joy to confusion to dawning humiliation in the space of a heartbeat before she pushed back from the table so violently her chair tipped backward and she fled from the room with a sob that echoed off the high ceiling. Lord Sinclair's mouth hung open in shocked disbelief while Lady Caroline pressed both hands to her face as tears of joy streamed down her cheeks, and the other guests dissolved into a cacophony of whispered exclamations and stunned speculation. But through it all, Alexander remained perfectly still, his grey eyes locked on Eleanor's face with an intensity that burned through her shock, his hand still holding hers beneath the table with that same gentle, unbreakable grip, his thumb continuing its devastating stroke across her knuckles as if to anchor her to reality. Eleanor knew that everyone was watching her, waiting for her response, that she held in this moment the power to accept his public declaration or to refuse and humiliate them both before the entire assembly. And some distant rational part of her mind whispered that she should question this, should demand to know why he had chosen her, should protect herself from what must surely be some elaborate mistake or incomprehensible act of pity. But the feel of his hand wrapped around hers and the raw vulnerability she saw in his eyes as he waited for her answer dissolved every defense she had spent 29 years constructing. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged at first, her voice trapped somewhere behind the tears that were threatening to spill over, and she saw something flicker in Alexander's expression that might have been fear, and that tiny crack in his composure gave her the strength to speak as she realized that somehow, impossibly, he was as vulnerable in this moment as she was, that he had gambled everything on her response and was genuinely uncertain of the outcome. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but in the hushed room it carried clearly as she said yes. Just that single word. And then again with more strength. "Yes, I will." And she felt Alexander's entire body relax as his hand tightened around hers, and a smile of such pure relief and joy transformed his face that she forgot entirely about the watching guests and smiled back at him through tears that were now falling freely down her cheeks. Lady Ashworth rose from her chair with a sound of outrage and swept from the room in Sophia's wake, but Lord Ashworth remained seated and raised his glass with a quiet smile, saying that he was pleased to give his blessing to a match he believed would bring his eldest daughter the happiness she had always deserved, and Lady Caroline rushed around the table to embrace Eleanor, while the other guests slowly began offering congratulations, though their faces reflected varying degrees of shock, skepticism, and in Lord Sinclair's case, barely concealed scandal. But Eleanor was aware of none of it, because Alexander had finally released her hand only to bring it to his lips and press a kiss to her knuckles that she felt in every nerve of her body. His eyes never leaving hers as he murmured words meant only for her hearing that they would speak privately soon, and she would understand everything. Eleanor barely registered the remainder of the evening's chaos as guests departed in whispered clusters and her father quietly herded the remaining family members to their separate corners of the estate, her mind still reeling from the impossible reality that Alexander had announced their engagement before an entire assembly, and when Lady Caroline finally embraced her and whispered that she must go to him, that he was waiting in the library, Eleanor found herself walking through the candlelit corridors as if in a dream, her burgundy skirts whispering against the marble floors as she made her way to the room that had become their sanctuary over the past days. She paused at the library door, her hand trembling on the handle, fear suddenly flooding through her that when she entered she would discover this had all been some elaborate mistake, or worse, some act of noble pity that would devastate her more completely than a lifetime of invisibility ever had. But before she could retreat, the door opened from within, and Alexander stood before her, still in his formal evening clothes, though he had discarded his cravat, and his dark hair was dishevelled as if he had been running his hands through it. He said nothing, simply stepped back to allow her entry, and she moved past him into the library, where a fire burned low in the hearth, and the familiar scent of leather and paper usually brought her comfort, but now only heightened her awareness of how thoroughly her world had shifted on its axis in the space of a single evening. Alexander closed the door behind them, and then moved to stand before the fire, maintaining a careful distance between them that Eleanor recognized as deliberate, as if he understood that she was balanced on the knife edge of belief and disbelief, and any sudden movement might send her fleeing, and when he finally spoke his voice was rough with an emotion she could not name. As he said that he owed her an explanation, that she deserved to understand why he had chosen to announce their engagement in such a public and dramatic fashion. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire, and heard her own voice emerge small and uncertain as she asked the question that terrified her most. Whether this was pity? Whether he had somehow felt obligated to rescue the pathetic spinster sister from her obscurity. And she watched his face transform with something that looked almost like pain as he crossed the distance between them in 3 swift strides, stopping just short of touching her as he said with fierce intensity that what he felt for her was the opposite of pity, that she had captivated him from the first moment he saw her in his entrance courtyard making that observation about the Georgian architecture, that every conversation they had shared in this very library had only deepened his certainty that she was the woman he had been searching for without knowing it. She stared at him through tears that were beginning to spill over as he continued speaking, his words tumbling out as if a dam had broken, telling her that he had sought her father's permission 2 days ago, that the public announcement had been strategic because he knew her mother would interfere if given the opportunity, that holding her hand beneath the table had been his way of telling her what he could not yet say aloud. And Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble as she whispered that she did not understand why he would choose her when he could have anyone. And Alexander finally closed the remaining distance between them and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs as he said that he chose her because she was intelligent and perceptive and kind, because she saw beauty in things others overlooked, because when she smiled at something she was reading, it transformed her entire face, because in a world of performance and pretense she was genuinely herself. And Eleanor released a sound that was half sob, half laugh, as she finally allowed herself to believe what she saw in his eyes, and she breathed the word, "Why?" again, but this time it was wonder rather than doubt, and Alexander smiled with such tenderness, it stole her breath as he answered simply, "Because I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since the day you arrived here, and I will love you for the rest of my life, if you will let me." Eleanor woke the morning of April 24th to bright sunlight streaming through the windows of her bedroom at Thornfield, and for a disorienting moment she thought perhaps the events of the previous evening had been an elaborate dream conjured by her desperate imagination. But then she saw the emerald ring on her left hand catching the light, and reality rushed back in a dizzying wave that left her breathless as she pressed her fingers to her lips and remembered Alexander's declaration in the library, his voice rough with emotion as he told her he loved her and had loved her from the beginning. She dressed with trembling hands in a pale blue morning dress that Lady Caroline had insisted she borrow months ago when Eleanor had protested she had nothing suitable for a house party, and as her maid arranged her hair, Eleanor studied her reflection in the mirror and was startled to see that her face looked different somehow, softer and more alive than the resigned mask she had worn for years, though beneath the wonder in her eyes lurked a persistent fear that this fragile new reality might shatter at any moment when Alexander realized his mistake. The walk to the breakfast room required more courage than Eleanor had known she possessed, because she would now face the assembled guests and her family as Alexander's acknowledged betrothed rather than as the invisible spinster sister, and when she paused outside the door, she heard the low murmur of conversation within, and Lady Caroline's bright voice saying something about spring weather, and Eleanor took a breath and stepped inside to find every head turning toward her, with expressions ranging from warm congratulation to barely concealed scandal. Alexander was already seated at the table, but he rose immediately when she entered, his grey eyes finding hers with such open warmth that Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, and he crossed to her side and offered his arm to escort her to the chair beside his own, a gesture of public claiming that would have been presumptuous yesterday, but was now his right, and Eleanor allowed herself to accept his support as she moved through the gauntlet of watching eyes to take her place at his side. Lady Ashworth sat at the far end of the table in rigid silence, her face a mask of cold disapproval as she studiously ignored Eleanor's presence, while Sophia picked at her breakfast with red eyes that she would not raise from her plate, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension that made Eleanor's throat tight. But then Lord Ashworth raised his teacup in a small private toast to her and smiled with genuine warmth, and Lady Caroline reached across the table to squeeze Eleanor's hand with tears of joy still visible in her eyes from the previous evening. Alexander served Eleanor her breakfast himself, passing her toast and pouring her tea with attentive care that felt both foreign and wonderful, and when his hand brushed hers as he handed her the cup, she did not pull away, but instead met his eyes and offered him a small, tentative smile, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in his presence, and she watched something transform in his expression that made her realize with sudden clarity that he had been as uncertain as she was, that beneath his confident public declaration lay genuine vulnerability about whether she would truly accept him. A footman entered with the Morning Post and delivered a letter to Lord Ashworth, who scanned it quickly before announcing with a wry smile that news of the engagement had already reached London and they should expect an influx of correspondence. And Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she realized that there would be no retreat now, that the entire ton would soon know that the Duke of Thornfield had chosen the overlooked spinster, Eleanor Ashworth, over her beautiful younger sister. The days following their public engagement unfolded for Eleanor like a revelation she had not known to hope for, as Alexander courted her with an intentionality that made clear his declaration in the library had been no momentary impulse, but rather the culmination of feelings carefully considered and deeply held. On the morning of April 25th, he found her in the library as had become their pattern. But now, instead of maintaining the careful distance propriety had previously required, he sat beside her on the settee and asked if she would walk with him through the gardens, and Eleanor discovered that accepting his offered arm in daylight, with the full awareness that she had every right to do so, brought a joy she had never imagined possible in her 29 years of life. They walked the gravelled paths bordered by late spring blooms while Alexander spoke of his childhood at Thornfield, and Eleanor heard beneath his words a loneliness that mirrored her own, the isolation that came from being seen only for position and circumstance rather than for the person one truly was, and when she tentatively shared her own experience of years spent invisible in drawing rooms full of people who looked past her as if she were merely part of the furniture, Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her, with such intensity in his grey eyes that her breath caught as he said he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never felt invisible again. That afternoon, Lady Caroline convinced Eleanor to join a riding party, despite her protests that she had not ridden in years. And when Alexander personally selected a gentle mare for her and rode at her side through the parkland, Eleanor discovered that her skills had not entirely deserted her, and she caught him watching her with undisguised admiration as the wind loosened tendrils of her hair from their pins and brought colour to her cheeks. The evening of April 26th found them in the drawing-room where the remaining house guests had gathered for music, and when someone requested Eleanor play the pianoforte, she initially demurred from habit, but Alexander said quietly that he would very much like to hear her play, and so she found herself seated at the instrument with trembling fingers, choosing a Mozart sonata she had loved since girlhood, and as the notes filled the room, she forgot her audience until the final chord faded, and she looked up to find Alexander standing beside the piano, with an expression of such tender regard that she felt tears prick her eyes. Later that evening, when the other guests had retired, Alexander kept her back with a gentle touch to her elbow and led her once more to the library, where a fire burned against the spring chill. And there, in the flickering light, he spoke of his hopes for their future together, asking her thoughts on matters great and small, whether she would prefer to spend most of their time at Thornfield or divide the year between his various properties, how many children she might wish for, what charities and causes she cared most deeply about, and Eleanor realized with wonder that he was not simply offering her his name and position, but genuinely seeking to build a life that would bring her happiness and fulfillment. The evening of April 27th arrived with the soft, golden light of late spring, and Alexander found Eleanor in the drawing room after dinner, where she had retreated to the window seat overlooking the gardens, and he approached with a quiet intensity that made her heart quicken as he asked if she would walk with him outside. And though propriety suggested Lady Caroline should accompany them as chaperone, Eleanor found herself agreeing to go alone with him into the deepening dusk because she trusted him in a way she had never trusted any man before. They walked in silence at first down the gravel path that led to the rose garden, where the early blooms were just beginning to open, their fragrance hanging heavy in the warm air, and Alexander guided her to a stone bench positioned beneath an arbor where climbing roses would soon create a canopy of white blossoms. And when they sat, he did not immediately speak, but instead took both her hands in his and looked at her with such solemnity that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. He began by saying that he knew the announcement at dinner had been abrupt and strategic, a necessary maneuver to circumvent her mother's interference and prevent Eleanor from fleeing Thornfield before he could secure her, but that he had not yet asked her properly in the way she deserved, in the way he had imagined asking since the third day of her visit, when he had known with absolute certainty that she was the woman he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as Alexander told her that he had fallen in love with her intelligence first, with the way her mind worked through problems of estate management and philosophy with equal facility, with her dry wit that she deployed so quietly most people never noticed. And then he had fallen in love with her dignity, the way she bore years of being overlooked without becoming bitter or small. And finally, he had fallen in love with her kindness, the gentleness she showed to servants and animals and anyone society deemed beneath notice, and he said that if she would truly have him, he would spend every remaining day proving himself worthy of the gift of her presence in his life. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a ring that caught the fading light, an emerald the deep green of summer forests surrounded by small diamonds that glittered like stars, and he explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had told him as a boy to save it for a woman of substance and character rather than mere beauty. And he asked Eleanor Ashworth if she would do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife not as a matter of strategic announcement, but as a true choice of her heart. Eleanor found that she could not speak past the tears streaming down her face, but she nodded and held out her trembling left hand, and as Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, she whispered that she loved him, the first time she had spoken those words aloud, and she watched his face transform with a joy so pure it took her breath away before he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that quickly deepened into passion, as years of loneliness and longing poured out between them in the gathering darkness of the rose garden, while the first stars emerged overhead. The morning of April 28th dawned clear and bright, and Eleanor woke in her chamber with the emerald ring still on her finger, and the memory of Alexander's kiss still warming her lips, but the joy that suffused her heart was tempered by the knowledge that she must face her family, and particularly her mother, whose fury had been palpable in the days since the shocking announcement. She dressed with care in a gown of pale blue that Alexander had admired during their ride, and when she descended to the breakfast room, she found him already there, waiting for her with such tender regard in his grey eyes that she felt fortified for whatever confrontation lay ahead, and he rose immediately to hold her chair with a possessive gentleness that announced to everyone present that Eleanor Ashworth was under his protection now. Her father sat at the table with his newspaper, and when he looked up at her entrance, Eleanor saw approval and something like relief in his expression as he nodded to her. But her mother maintained a rigid silence that filled the room with ice, and Sophia picked at her food without looking up, though Eleanor noticed her sister's eyes were red from weeping. The meal proceeded in uncomfortable quiet until Lady Ashworth set down her teacup with a sharp click and announced that she wished to speak with Eleanor privately. But before Eleanor could respond, Alexander said in a tone that brooked no argument that anything Lady Ashworth wished to say to his betrothed could be said in his presence, and the steel beneath his polished courtesy made clear he would not be dismissed from this conversation. Lady Ashworth's face flushed with anger as she said that Eleanor had manipulated circumstances and stolen what rightfully belonged to her sister, that a woman of 29 with no beauty or prospects had no business aspiring to a duke, that the scandal would ruin them all, and Eleanor felt the old familiar shame beginning to creep over her until Alexander stood and said in a voice trembling with controlled fury that he would not permit anyone to speak of Eleanor in such terms, even her own mother. He stated with devastating precision that he had chosen Eleanor for her intelligence, her character, her grace, and her kindness, qualities that he found infinitely more valuable than youth or conventional beauty, and that if Lady Ashworth could not treat her daughter with respect, then she would find herself unwelcome at Thornfield and excluded from their lives once they were wed. The room fell into shocked silence at this pronouncement, until Lord Ashworth spoke quietly, saying that he had given his blessing to the match because he had watched Eleanor sacrifice her own happiness for years to smooth her mother's social climbing and her sister's advancement, and he believed she deserved a man who saw her true worth. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as her father continued, saying he was proud to call the Duke of Thornfield his son. And then Sophia rose suddenly and fled from the room, and Eleanor knew she must follow, because whatever anger she felt toward her sister, they were still bound by blood and years of shared history. Eleanor found Sophia in her chamber standing at the window with her arms wrapped around herself. And when Eleanor closed the door softly behind her, the silence stretched between them, thick with years of unspoken resentments and unacknowledged hurts, until Sophia turned with tears streaming down her face and said in a voice breaking with emotion that she knew she should hate Eleanor, but found she could not, because she had never truly wanted the Duke, only the idea of him, the fantasy of being a duchess that their mother had planted in her mind like a seed that had taken root and choked out her own desires. Eleanor stood frozen as her sister continued, saying that she had watched Eleanor disappear over the years, becoming quieter and greyer and smaller, always standing in corners or by windows as though trying not to take up space in the world, and Sophia confessed that she had been complicit in that erasure because it had been easier to accept their mother's favoritism than to question whether that favoritism was destroying them both in different ways. Sophia said she had seen the way the Duke looked at Eleanor in the library, and during their garden walks had recognized even before their mother did that his interest lay with the sister everyone had dismissed, and she admitted with brutal honesty that her tears were not primarily for the loss of Alexander, but for the loss of the future she had been taught to want, for the realization that at 19 she had no idea what she actually desired beyond escaping their mother's suffocating expectations. Eleanor felt her own tears falling as she crossed the room and took Sophia's hands, and she told her sister that she understood what it meant to live according to someone else's vision, to suppress one's own nature in service of impossible standards, and she said that if Sophia could forgive her for accepting the happiness that had been intended for her, then Eleanor would help her sister discover what she truly wanted from life, beyond the marriage mart and social positioning that Lady Ashworth valued above all else. Sophia gripped Eleanor's hands tightly and asked in a whisper if Eleanor truly loved the Duke, or if she had accepted him out of desperation to escape their mother's house. And Eleanor answered with absolute certainty that she loved Alexander Pembroke more than she had imagined it possible to love another person, that he saw her as she truly was and valued precisely those qualities their mother had taught her to hide, and that for the first time in her 29 years she felt fully alive and visible and worthy. Sophia embraced her then with a fierceness that spoke of genuine affection beneath years of competitive conditioning, and she whispered that she was happy for Eleanor, even as she grieved the loss of her own illusions. And Eleanor held her younger sister and promised that they would face their mother's disapproval together, that Sophia would not be left alone to bear the weight of Lady Ashworth's disappointed ambitions. And in that moment, something shifted between them as they began the difficult work of becoming true sisters rather than rivals in a contest neither had chosen to enter. The reconciliation with Sophia left Eleanor feeling lighter than she had in years, and when she returned to her own chamber to prepare for the afternoon, she found Alexander waiting in the hallway outside her door with such concern etched on his face that she immediately went to him and took his hand without thinking of propriety or who might see them together, and he drew her into the window alcove where they could speak privately and asked if her conversation with Sophia had gone poorly, judging by the tears he could see had been shed. Eleanor smiled through the dampness still clinging to her lashes and told him that the tears had been healing ones, that she and Sophia had spoken honestly for perhaps the first time in their lives, and that while the wounds of years could not be mended in a single conversation, they had made a beginning toward genuine sisterhood. And Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with such tenderness that Eleanor felt her heart might overflow with the sheer improbability of this man's devotion. He told her that he had spent the morning dealing with correspondence that had arrived from London, that word of their engagement had spread through society with the speed of wildfire, and that the responses ranged from shock to congratulations to thinly veiled speculation about what madness had possessed a duke to choose a woman so far beyond the marriageable age. But he said this last part with a fierce protectiveness that made clear he would tolerate no criticism of her from any quarter, regardless of rank or social standing. Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of facing London society as Alexander's betrothed, of enduring the stares and whispers and cruel assessments that would surely follow their return to town. But when she voiced these fears, Alexander cupped her face in his hands and told her that she would face nothing alone, that he would be beside her at every ball and dinner and social engagement, and that anyone who wished to remain in his good graces would learn to treat the future Duchess of Thornfield with the respect and admiration she deserved. The title still sounded foreign to Eleanor's ears. Duchess, a word that belonged to women of beauty and consequence and impeccable lineage, not to spinsters who had spent years making themselves small and invisible, but Alexander seemed to read her thoughts because he said that she had always possessed the grace and dignity befitting a duchess, that her years of quiet endurance had only strengthened the nobility of her character, and that he was honored beyond measure that she had agreed to share his life and his name. Eleanor realized in that moment, standing in the alcove with afternoon light streaming through the window and Alexander's hands warm against her face, that she was beginning to believe him, beginning to accept that perhaps her worth was not determined by her mother's dismissal or society's narrow definitions, but by the content of her heart and the quality of her mind. And she told Alexander that she loved him with a certainty that surprised her with its strength. He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, and Eleanor no longer cared if a servant or guest might happen upon them because she was tired of hiding and diminishing herself. And when they finally drew apart, Alexander suggested they take a ride across the estate, so he could show her the lands that would soon be hers to manage alongside him. And Eleanor agreed with a joy that felt almost painful in its intensity. They rode out together that afternoon, with only a single groom following at a discreet distance, and Eleanor felt a freedom in the saddle she had not experienced since her youth, when her father had still noticed her enough to ensure she had proper instruction, and Alexander watched her with undisguised admiration as she guided her mount with practiced ease across the rolling hills of the Thornfield estate, the wind catching tendrils of her dark hair that had escaped from beneath her riding hat and bringing colour to cheeks that had been pale for so many years in drawing rooms where she had made herself invisible. He showed her the tenant farms where families had lived for generations, introducing her to men and women who worked the land with calloused hands and weather-worn faces, and Eleanor was struck by how Alexander knew each person by name, knew the ages of their children and the conditions of their crops, and she understood that his wealth and title were not merely ornamental but came with responsibilities that he took seriously. And when the tenants looked at her with cautious curiosity, Alexander introduced her as his betrothed with such pride that Eleanor felt tears prickling behind her eyes at the simple miracle of being claimed so openly. They stopped at the crest of a hill overlooking the estate's western boundary, where an ancient oak tree provided shade, and Alexander helped her dismount with his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary, and they stood together looking out over the patchwork of fields and forests that stretched toward the horizon, while he told her that he had inherited Thornfield at the age of 24 when his father died suddenly, that he had spent the past 10 years learning to manage the responsibilities of the dukedom while feeling profoundly alone despite being surrounded by servants and stewards and society's constant attention. Eleanor listened without interruption as Alexander spoke of the isolation that came with his position, how every unmarried woman in society had looked at him with calculating ambition rather than genuine interest, how every conversation had felt like a performance where people told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than speaking with authentic honesty. And he said that from the first evening at dinner he had been captivated by Eleanor's refusal to perform or dissemble, by the way she had answered his questions with thoughtful intelligence rather than simpering flattery. And he confessed that he had fallen in love with her mind first, and then with her quiet dignity, and then with the sadness in her eyes that spoke of years of being unseen and undervalued. Eleanor felt her defenses crumbling completely as she listened to this powerful man reveal his own vulnerabilities, and she told him that she had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of notice that she had almost forgotten how to hope for anything beyond the margins of other people's lives, that becoming invisible had seemed safer than risking the pain of reaching for something beyond her grasp and being rejected, but that he had somehow seen through her protective coloring to the woman she had hidden even from herself. And Alexander turned her to face him and said that she had never been invisible to him, that from the moment she had stepped out of the carriage at Thornfield he had been unable to look away, and he kissed her there beneath the oak tree with the spring breeze carrying the scent of wild flowers and the distant sound of sheep bells drifting up from the valley below. They returned to the house in the golden light of late afternoon, with their cheeks flushed and their hearts full, and Eleanor felt as though she were inhabiting a different body than the one she had carried for 29 years, this new form lighter and more expansive, as though years of compression had suddenly released and allowed her to expand into the space she had always been meant to occupy. And when they entered the drawing-room where the other guests had gathered for tea, she no longer felt the instinct to shrink against the walls or make herself invisible, but instead walked beside Alexander with her hand resting in the crook of his arm as he guided her to a settee near the fire, and sat beside her with the sort of casual intimacy that declared their connection to everyone present. Lord Sinclair watched them with barely concealed fascination, his expression caught between disapproval and reluctant intrigue, while Lady Caroline caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and raised her teacup in a subtle salute that made Eleanor smile despite the discomfort of being so openly observed. And she realized that learning to endure the scrutiny of others would be one of many adjustments required by her new position as the Duke of Thornfield's intended bride. Sophia entered the drawing room a few moments later, looking pale but composed, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anxiety at the prospect of another confrontation. But her sister surprised her by approaching directly and asking in a voice that trembled only slightly if she might sit with them for a moment, and Alexander stood with immediate courtesy and offered Sophia his own seat before excusing himself to speak with Lord Ashworth across the room, clearly recognizing that the sisters needed privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Sophia settled onto the settee with her hands folded tightly in her lap and spent several seconds studying the pattern of the carpet before finally looking up at Eleanor with eyes that held none of the anger or resentment Eleanor had braced herself to encounter, and instead her sister's expression showed only a bewildered sort of curiosity as she said that she had spent the past hours thinking about everything that had transpired and trying to understand how she had so badly misread the situation. And Eleanor felt her defensive walls beginning to rise before Sophia continued speaking, and said that upon reflection she realized she had never truly wanted Alexander himself, but only the position and validation that marriage to a duke would have provided. That she had been performing the role of devoted admirer without ever actually seeing him as a person with thoughts and preferences of his own. Eleanor found herself softening as she listened to her sister's halting confession, recognizing in Sophia's words the same painful self-awareness that had been growing in her own heart over the past days. And when Sophia asked with genuine confusion what Alexander saw in Eleanor that he had not found in women who were younger and lovelier and more suited to his rank, Eleanor surprised herself by answering with complete honesty that she did not fully understand it either, that she had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of notice that accepting his regard still felt like trying to read by candlelight after years of darkness. But that Alexander seemed to value qualities in her that society dismissed as irrelevant, and perhaps that was the nature of true love rather than strategic alliance.